Hello, I'm Jeannie Miller, and here with my colleagues Hanson, Ryan Gibney, Michelle Renee with Embrace Surrogate Partner Therapy Professional Resource Group. And today we wanted to talk about the Triadic model, the model that we use in SPT for collaboration with uh, licensed talk therapists for supporting clients. So we wanted to talk just a little bit about what it is, why it is, and how um, clients, surrogate partners, and therapists work together in this model. So um, Lou, maybe you could start and just talk a little bit about what we mean when we say triadic model. What is that?
Sure. I am Lou Hanson. I'm a woman in the Embrace group that wears two hats. I am a trained surrogate partner since 2015 and also have just started supervising work for other surrogate colleagues, which is great. When we say the triadic model, and people hear us come back to this all the time, we are very we're very strict is not the word I want to use, but we come back to this all the time because really the model of surrogate partner therapy was built on what we call the triadic model, which is to say that there are three parts of it. There's the surrogate partner, which is us, there's the supervising therapist, and there is the client. So that's the three parts of the triadic model. And what it is a particular system of how those three parts function together so that it keeps a container that really supports a clinical lens, a therapeutic approach to the work that we do with our clients.
Awesome. And Michelle, Brian, is there anything that you want to add to that, just in terms of defining what it is?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
go ahead, Brian.
I think it is important to note that in a therapeutic triad, what it is everybody has their role, and it's a role of peers. So the clinician and the practitioner together are in equal standing. One is not the agent of another, although they do have very different roles in the therapeutic triad. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we kind of dig deeper into what the therapeutic triad is and what it does.
Sure, I think that's a great point to emphasize. So with that, Michelle, I wonder if you could talk a little about what is the theory behind this, right? Why is this collaboration important rather than a client working separately with these two, completely separately with these professionals, or working with just a surrogate partner without a therapist being involved?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeannie. I'm Michelle Renee. I'm a surrogate partner in Baltimore, DC area. I work Philly through the Mid-Atlantic. Well, I come from cuddle world, which always has the question of like transference and countertransference, and what do you do when your client falls in love with you, and all these complicated feelings. And so when I came into surrogate partner therapy, having that therapist as part of the team alleviated a lot of that, because there's always kind of this there's a reminder that this is a professional relationship. There's like another set of eyes that maybe isn't involved in, say, a client that went to a therapeutic sex worker, right? There's another participant keeping an eye on the relationship. There's a lot of things that come up in the work that they like. I don't want to be the therapist and the partner. I think that's a big part of it. The client gets to have that person to turn to process the session with. That's not me. That helps our container as the relationship container. What else? Anybody else have something they want to add to that? I've never talked on this specific points of this before.
I would love to build off of that if everybody's cool with that. I got super excited last time. I didn't introduce myself, so I'm Brian Gibney. I get so excited and geeky about this stuff. I'm like just launching right in. I'm Brian Gibney.
He really does, folks.
I really do. I am a surrogate partner in Virginia, and I work all up and down the East Coast. I also do intimacy coaching with couples, and it's interesting to note how I show up differently in surrogate partner therapy versus working with couples. We might be able to delve into that a little bit. So, geez, I get sidetracked really easily. Michelle, you were talking about therapeutic triad. Oh, so me being a science geek that I am, the question is always, how do we isolate the variables, right? How do I show up with a client in the room, both as myself, as a person with my own wants and needs, and as a clinician? That's a dual relationship. And most people in the therapeutic world are going, dual relationship danger, Will Robinson, like that's scary. We can work in this beautiful dual relationship, which can be very, very powerful as long as we have someone outside of that relationship keeping tabs on it, right? So that allows us to delve in deeper, to take that therapeutic barrier that most clinicians see as, rigid or even maybe semi-permeable. We walk right through that barrier. We're in the relationship with the client, and we are able to say, this is my experience as a person, this is my experience as a clinician, and have the therapist on the outside say, okay, I can affirm that what you are reacting to is a real thing. Like this is from the client and this is from you. And we get to talk about that. We get to talk about that interplay. And then the therapist gets to share that with the client too. How are you showing up with your practitioner versus how are you showing up with me? What are the challenges in the relationship there? How is it different? It gets really, really cool because we get to be very, very aware of our role in the relationship and how it affects the relationship.
I'm glad that you mentioned that piece about relationships too, because I went to social work school. I didn't become a talk therapist. I'm a surrogate partner. And I also got excited and forgot to introduce myself. Jeannie Miller. I'm a surrogate partner based in DC. And I think it's also helpful to understand that this model evolved partly from the traditional sex therapy model with couples, where the idea was that couples will be supported by a talk therapist in having learning experiences together outside of the therapy session, and then coming and talking about them with the therapist. The idea is that it's not like a physical therapist, say, where that example actually, or maybe a massage therapist, where you go, somebody works on your body and you receive that work and you benefit from it. The point is that you're going to do work with the surrogate partner therapy you're going to do work with the surrogate partner rather that's going to bring up a lot of stuff for you. It's going to bring up questions, challenges, things that you really need to sort of reflect, internalize, figure out how to generalize. And the surrogate partner isn't necessarily the best person to do all of that in addition, right? The client needs to be able to talk about it with somebody who's not the person that they experienced it with. And then the therapist and the surrogate partner, by collaborating actively and actually being able to share their observations about the client's experience, all three parties in this model are able to decide like how to direct the work, right? It's not just that therapists are going to send the client off to this other professional and they're going to like have this experience. But the idea is that we're all a team working together, and with the therapist, they can really process and dig into the experiences that they have working with the surrogate partner and everything that's coming up for them because of it, and everything that they're learning because of it, and ultimately how to generalize it to the rest of their lives.
Yeah, one theme that I heard emerge across what the team was saying about the triadic model is that not only is it essential so that the client gets the most out of this work, that they have these gorgeous experiences, but also get a chance to dig in with the therapist about what was going on, how did this interaction work, what came up for me, if stuff came up for me, but it's also wildly essential for us as surrogate partners to have someone to turn to and say, oh my gosh, this thing happened. It felt totally different than last time. And I'm wondering, do we think it's this part of me? Do we think it's this part of this person? It reminds me of a pattern that we noticed early on in our work. What do we think about that? Because it's true that we have to do both. We have to be present in the room as our imperfect, whole, authentic selves to give our clients that experience of having a real, genuine interaction with a stand-in partner. But we also have to know what we're looking for. We've got to keep track of these patterns. And to that end, it's really helpful to keep humility and turn to the therapist and say, this is what I felt. And also, I'm aware that I bring stuff into this room. So help me tease out what about this is mine and what is the client's.
I'll say too that, oh, go ahead, Michelle.
I want to add something. Like I also have run into this with the importance of this established relationship between the client and the therapist before our work starts, right? Because I've had supervising clinicians who did not have a well-established relationship with the client. And then when I notice something, it's nearly impossible to go back and say, is this a pattern with this client? I'm feeling this sense of manipulation or whatever happening. And when that clinician doesn't have a strong enough history with the client, it's a missed opportunity. And so that came to mind when I think about the why or how this works, that established relationship is part of that triadic experience.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's a good segue into talking about, actually, maybe Brian, you could sort of lead us into talking about, okay, I get this in theory. How does this actually work in practice?
Right. I was just going to ask if I could delve into that. And I do want to say, like, how I view the timeline of the therapeutic triad and what happens within the therapeutic triad at certain parts isn't a universal rule, right? So this is something that if you're talking to a surrogate partner, if you're talking to another practitioner, ask about it. Ask about, like, so what does the therapeutic triad mean to you? How do you show up in it? When does it start? Since I do a lot of lecturing about this, I'm happy to give like like, this is kind of a textbook-ish version, and everybody else can kind of like add on to that. So like Michelle said, the therapeutic triad absolutely, I think, has to start before the surrogate partner meets the client. There needs to be an established relationship with the client and the collaborating clinician, the therapist. So there's a relationship of trust. There's some history there. So then when the client says, I think, surrogate partner might be right for me, the clinician can talk to the practitioner and say, okay, here's a client. This is their history. These are their goals. These are what I think their challenges are going to be. This is before we even decide if we want to do surrogate partner therapy. And what that enables me to do is then have my own intake with a client and say, okay, how is the client showing up with me? Are they viewing their goals the same way that the clinician is viewing their goals? What do they share about their history with me? So it already starts even during this kind of intake, feeling each other out phase. I then get to go back to the clinician and say, okay, these are where things lined up. These are where things didn't. This is how the client presented themselves in their discussion with me. And the big question is this work appropriate for a client? I've absolutely had discussions with a client and with a therapist where I'm just like, I don't think they're ready for it yet. I think they need to work on this, this, and this. And more often than not, that can be accomplished by just more time in talk therapy. One of the really important things that we do when we're establishing a therapeutic triad is have a triadic meeting. So if we have all had our intake interviews, if we have talked about things in general about whether or not the client is appropriate, and it's a big thumbs up from everybody, we get together, the three of us in the same room, and we essentially have the same talk over again to make sure that we're all on the same page. What is the history? What are the obstacles? Or what are the goals? And also talk about managing expectations. What does surrogate partner therapy look like? What can it do? What can't it do? I am not here to promise sexual services to a client. That's not what the work is. And many clients come into that with a misconception. Many therapists come into it with a misconception of that. So we're all on the same page of what the arc of surrogate partner therapy can look like, what the therapeutic triad is, the free exchange of information between the three of us. We don't have secrets. This is what our scheduled appointments look like. And if we all three as a group decide to go on, cool. I meet back with the client, I figure out logistics, and then I constantly communicate that to the clinician. So again, this is all happening even before I'm meeting face-to-face with the client. Once we do finally meet face-to-face, I will create notes for the session. I will give those back to a therapist. We'll have a talk about it. And the client knows to expect that. So then when they see the therapist, they get to go into the session and they give their debrief of what happened. What are the exercises that we did? How did they feel? What is my general impression of my surrogate partner? And we get to use those two stories that are happening in parallel to explore the relationship. As the relationship matures over the arc of surrogate partner therapy, the triad starts to shift. The mechanics are still the same, right? We still have our sessions, we still share notes, we still have regular check-ins every time we have a session. But my role as a surrogate partner starts to shift. I start to show up less as a teacher and more as authentic Brian. So the therapist helps the client in that transition and gets to process things a little bit differently. Not how does this exercise make you feel, but how does your experience with Brian make you feel? And over the course of this arc, what we're doing is, I use this a lot. We are kind of finding the working edge of discomfort. Every client is going to have their own hurdles or obstacles. We don't really know when we're going to bump into those things. But in the therapeutic triad, we get to, as Jeannie said before, we get to say, boom, we hit this obstacle. I have someone else now that I can process that obstacle with. And that's one of the beautiful things about therapeutic triad. After we go through the arc of surrogate partner therapy, whether it's a shorter arc or whether it's a longer arc, and we can talk about what short and long mean maybe in a different session, there's inevitably going to be an end. That is baked into this relationship. So one of the most essential things that a therapist can do is help clients examine, what does it feel like to be done? Because guess what? We're never fully perfect. We're never fully done. But what does it mean to be done with this work? And then process feelings around, wow, this person has been in my life and they have been through so many changes with me. What is it going to be like when they're gone? What is it going to be like when I don't have the support structure here? And how can I translate these skills from this really tightly controlled container with a professional into the wild with other people? We call that generalization. So the therapist really plays an essential role in that end phase where we process the end of the relationship, and then continuing on when SPT is done, we don't just say, woohoo, you know, high fives, everybody, and then we all stop talking to each other. The therapist and the client absolutely have to continue talking to each other to help process the generalization, to deal with the grief that may come up, and to help them apply lessons that they learned in the relationship. And I realize I talked a lot about that, so y'all
No,
jump in as you want.
That was super great, Brian. So that's sort of a great sort of, you know, general overview. Like, this is how it's generally going to proceed. And I know, Lou and Michelle, you'll have some things to add about different wrinkles of, you know, how it's worked for you in different cases.
Yeah, I feel like one part that I really want to highlight is this: once we are in the flow, once we've done this really well orchestrated forming of the triadic team, and we're in our pattern of surrogate client session, surrogate sends a note to a therapist, surrogate debriefs with a therapist, processes plans, therapist has their session with a client. Part of the magic of what happens is when we get really invested, really clinically savvy supervising therapists, is that they get to track at a level that almost never happens out of the triadic model. They get to hear our report of what happened when we say, oh, there was this really funny glitch that happened, and how was that? And they get to observe, how did the client report that to me? If the client reported it to me, right? There's always so much. It's so telling what never makes it into the client room, when what they don't bring from their surrogate session to therapy, what they see in a completely different way than what the surrogate saw, right? There's also a lot of strategy around this. You know, Michelle spoke earlier about clients who can sometimes be limit testing, or potentially, whether consciously or unconsciously, a little manipulative, and to say, like, what strategy are you taking with the client if they're also presenting this way for you in therapy? Do we want to, is this a situation where we think it would be beneficial to both have the same strategy? Or, since client is super comfortable with that, do we want to try a slightly different strategy? Do we want me to be a little bit more directive and confrontational here, so that we are rocking the boat a little bit? So you've got some work to do around that. And that can be just absolutely gorgeous to have someone to help steer the path, because while we all come into the work with this sort of rough draft, with this big glorious toolbox full of exercises and themes and metaphors that we're going to work with the client, each client has such specific needs that I just cannot say enough about how valuable it is to have someone who's investing in tracking all of these little things with us, because we can feel it, right? And it matters. It matters that we are these human barometers in the room. And it's like, oh man, energy really shifted when this happens. And I know that there's, as a colleague of mine will say, there's some there, right? and right, help me dig for that, because sometimes clients aren't ready to do it with us, or they aren't ready to do it with their therapist. And it's really awesome to have these multiple paths to get at the same deep work, so that it can be really really fruitful and organized in such a way as to be most beneficial to the client.
Yeah, that's a thing that, you know, I've heard from therapists, just some folks working in this kind of collaboration, is it seems, you know, unfamiliar. It's a lot to wrap their head around. They're maybe used to working one-on-one with the client, and, you know, they have clinical supervision, they have peer supervision, but the relationship with the client is this container that's, you know, that they're just alone in, and it can feel even vulnerable, I think, for therapists to sort of let someone in and sort of be in this therapeutic team together. On the other hand, how great is it to actually be able to collaborate with another professional who, you know, unlike whoever you're getting clinical supervision from, who is great and you still need and want supporting you, to have another professional who is in the room with the client, and actually, you know, sees how they talk about things, how things come up for them, and you're able to get a whole different kind of sort of peer supervision or consultation. The other thing is, it's a fantastic ethical support and an essential one for both the surrogate partner and the therapist, for it can be some very intense and challenging work, to make sure that we're all keeping our focus on what will be most beneficial for the client. And that includes constantly coming back to, what are the client's needs, what are the vulnerabilities, what are their therapeutic goals, are those evolving, and separating that out from, maybe there's stuff that is coming up for each of us. There's certainly stuff that comes up for therapists sometimes in doing this work, to be able to sort of, compare notes with the surrogate partner and sort of really separate out and then focus on, okay, where do we go from here? And that, in this, there is the triad, there's one team, and there are also, in essence, as there always are when there are three people, there's three dyads. And you're all working together, the client and the therapist, the client, the surrogate partner, and the therapist, to advance the client's goals. And as we know, triangle is just about the most stable structure that you can build. Michelle, it seems like maybe you were gonna share something.
No, I don't think so. I feel like I don't have anything yet.
I would love to pick up threads. I think all of you mentioned a little bit, and provide a little bit of like anecdotal stuff. When clients report to us, they may say something entirely different than they say to therapists. They will share parts of their stories that a therapist may never hear. And one of the most powerful ways that showed up in work with a client is, a client came to me saying that they were a late life virgin, saying that they needed to understand what it was like to be in an intimate relationship, which is one of the things that surrogate partner therapy does. And I went through the work, the first parts of the work, assuming that they had little to no experience with others as far as sexual intimacy. But then as our relationship deepened, as there was more trust, this client shared more and more stories saying that they had actually a lot of sexual experience. And they had actually never shared that with a therapist because it didn't count. So the therapist and I took a step back and we're like, whoa, okay, so this means something totally different, right? We're working from a very different foundation than what we thought we were working from before. And we shifted from, okay, this is a primary experience for the client, to what does this experience mean if it is not a primary experience, in the kind of course act of intimacy, of physical intimacy? But what does it mean emotionally? Because if she thinks it doesn't count that these things were done, there has to be a reason why. And that became part of our work. That was one of the first layers that we had to overcome. And we wouldn't have ever figured that out if it weren't for the therapeutic triad. She would have stayed in talk therapy, and she would have continued to report the same way that she reports. And we all know, like, if we are relying only on clients as the sole source of information, their reporting is dicey at best. Like, this is why they're in therapy. We all do this. We all filter information through our own lens. But in therapeutic triad, you get to filter it through my lens too, right? We get to come and say, this is the information the client gave to me. This is how they're showing up in relationships. This big thing that seems to be a stumbling block for them, what's underneath that? What's motivating the client? What's causing it? It's really, really cool.
Yeah, what other examples do you want to share from how it's actually worked in practice? Maybe when it's worked best or when it's been challenging.
Ooh, yeah, I have recently an experience where a therapist really helped me get unstuck in my work with a client. I was noticing that based on my own baggage, completely admittedly, whenever this client would engage in some little forms of limit testing and manipulation, I just was so bristly. Like I had just such a strong reaction to it. And part of what the therapist helped talk me through is their perspective on where that was coming from, right? This, she had information about this client and deep information about nuclear family, deep information about narcissistic wounds that had happened when he was young. And it really helped me like taking on that reframe and being like, oh, okay, now I can really soften around this. Now I can really be compassionate around it as opposed to just kind of naturally being defensive, right? We have a lot of those moments in our work where if something doesn't feel right, it's our job to sense into that and to say, what is this about? Is this a me thing? Is this a them thing? And how do we work it out? Because we got to remember every single time this human is in relationship for the rest of their life, they're part of it, but also another authentic human being with other baggage is also part of it. So working that through and really strategizing with a therapist, like, okay, so how do we address this? Does this feel like a time when we address it directly? Does it feel like a time when, right, I can take on the burden of that for now, and then we can slowly work in more adjustment from client behavior? That it's really awesome to be able to take that to someone and work it out. A time it didn't work out, I had a therapist who I think fancied herself quite progressive, which sat really well. She really was pro surrogate partner therapy, but also was not traditionally a sex therapist. And you don't have to be a sex therapist per se in order to support surrogate client work. But part of the challenge that we got to is that there's relevant information that comes up when we get into the sexual phase of the work. And one of the things I had noticed with a particular client was that the way in which he stimulated himself when he masturbated was very different than the kind of stimulus he would receive from a typical partner doing hand sex or oral sex or from penetrative intercourse. And so it was really relevant to say, hey, can we have some strategy? Let's talk about how, if we want to work around him trying out some stimulus that'll be a little bit more like this, so that his body is a little more acclimated to this kind of stimulation when we get to those parts of the work. And the therapist was just beside herself, was completely shocked to be hearing such intimate information, felt like it was a total violation of the client's privacy. And that is something that now I know, having had that experience, that I go through in that initial meeting and I say, look, this isn't locker room talk. This isn't about the scandalous and delicious details. This is about stuff that's relevant. And sometimes the stuff that's relevant is pretty graphic, but I'm coming at it with a lens of, what am I looking for where I can find these spaces for growth, these spaces for learning opportunities, for intervention that can really support the client in meeting their goals. And I think it's really important for therapists to know that sometimes that involves some very intimate details. That is part of the work.
Yeah, I feel like my highlight and low light comes from the same, my stories come from the same exact client and therapist. Like Lou, when you talked about this discomfort around getting into the deep personal stuff, one of the things I look for now in a therapist because of this experience was this therapist was very much letting the client lead their sessions and not directly approaching the information that was in my notes to the therapist. And when I'd ask, it was like, well, they didn't bring it up. And it's like, that's not, I look for now when I look at new therapists is like, how direct are you willing to be in your sessions with the client? But at the same time, it didn't ruin our work together. Like it just made it a different challenge. But they were also really great at addressing when the client and I came to an impasse of like the client's idea of what the goals of our work were started to really deviate from what I was there to do. And in the end, what ended up happening is the therapist and I strategized another triadic meeting, which you would say at this point in the work was like couples counseling. And I got to talk about what I was willing to bring to the work, and was the client willing to meet me there, or was it time for us to either pause the work or end our relationship together because we couldn't get on the same page as to what the purpose of our work was anymore. And she was great at that. Like that was the most humanizing way to end the work together, right? Because this person super invested in our relationship, and talk about a breakup that maybe wasn't the summer romance breakup that maybe we thought was going to be at the end of our work, but a breakup that included a lot of really big feelings and disappointments and all of that. And that's another, beautiful moment of the triadic model is sometimes it's going to be really hard, and there's somebody there to catch the client on the other side when we just aren't in alignment anymore. So.
Yeah, that's there are some therapeutic triads that I've been in where Michelle, the clinician, has not been able to do that, and it's made it very, very challenging. Man, my best and worst, when you start this work and you were not young and naive and have textbook understanding of what it is like, and it is much muddier and much more complicated when you actually get into it. There are a lot of things that you learn really, really fast. One of my worst situations was when a therapist, even before I started working with a client, said that they really wanted to take me for a test drive. And I was hungry to do the work. I wanted to work with the client and help the client, and thought, that's not, this thing, like, it'll be fine. It wasn't fine. It tainted the therapeutic triad. It tainted my relationship with the therapist. When it came time to really re-examine the client's goals and talk about some of the obstacles to intimacy, the therapist just really wanted me to have sex with the client. And I said, that's not in my best interest, or in my best interest, or in the client's best interest. And the therapist said, well, that's what you're here for. So that perceived role of me being a sexual tool, a sexual object, that started off even before I started working with the client, carried over into the relationship and made it very, very hard to practice effectively. So that was probably one of the worst, grossest feelings I have ever had. Please don't do that if you're working with a surrogate partner. Some of the other wonderful things that I've had on the receiving end, have been when a client helps me manage my own feelings, and discusses how they relate to a client. Um, a little bit more self-disclosure, because this is what we do in the work. I am a father of a child who died because he had a severe physical disability. And for quite a few years, I was balancing feelings of loss and grief with also doing this work. And man, that's challenging. And luckily, in the beginning, I had some really good therapists who said, okay, how does this grief show up in the room with the client? Especially when I was working with clients who had the same physical disability as my son did. Having them talk me through that was incredibly helpful. I would love to say that the therapeutic triad is all in service of the client's goals. But we as practitioners, we need to be tuned up sometimes. And having a therapist there who knows the specific ouchy spots that a surrogate partner relationship is poking might be able to help with that. Is that the primary concern? No. Does it make sure that everything is running smoothly? It absolutely does. And as someone who's received that, that's helped a lot.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Brian, actually, because, it is important for therapists to understand, they're the client's therapist, they're not our therapist. The surrogate partners, we, very often have our own therapists for our own stuff that comes up in our work lives and our personal lives. And that's not the role that in the triadic model, the therapist, they're there for the client. At the same time, there is this intersection of, as you say, stuff that's going to come up in the work for the surrogate that as a Triadic team, you can strategize around how to navigate that in service of the client, which is, I think, an important distinction. But navigating together, strategizing around how to navigate the stuff that may come up from time to time for the surrogate, how to navigate it best in service of the client is a really important function of the triad sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all human, right? We all bring things into the room, whether it's relationship history, family dynamics, our own views of sexuality and mores and things like that. It's okay to call those out. It's okay to have a conversation with a surrogate and say, like, okay, so what is informing your relationship with this client? That's just as helpful as learning about how the client is responding to the relationship.
Yeah, and the converse can happen, right? Where sometimes things will come up for the therapist, and again, they will have their personal therapist or a supervising therapist, peer supervision, where they can really dig into that stuff. But sometimes the thing that a surrogate partner can do is just like notice, inquire, check about is some stuff coming up for therapists that they need to strategize about how to navigate, like we were talking about before, if they have feelings come up about some of the stuff that they're needing to talk about with the client about what they're doing with the surrogate. So I wanted to ask a really practical question, and I know there's different ways that people do this, about how we surrogate partners and as therapists use documentation, use paperwork, even in the triadic model, and how what kinds of documentation do you use, and how does that support the triadic model?
I feel like this is Lou. I am still trying to fine tune my documentation. I feel like at this point in the work, I tend to give more, which I get great feedback about, but also, the more clients you see, the less time you have for all of it. So it'll be interesting to see where that lands. But as it stands, I really like to break my notes apart. Like, was there anything that happened since the last session? Sometimes it's fascinating the ways that clients can push limits just in the, like, how are we scheduling? Are they testing boundaries by reaching out in between sessions for things that are not logistically related? Like, all of that is relevant. So putting space in the note to say, has anything come up in the interim that is noteworthy, right? To say what the exercises are of the day. Were we practicing sensate focus? Did we do a mirror meditation? What are the big themes, right? Are we really focused on body image acceptance? Are we really focused on building empathy? Like, where do I feel like our meat is right now, our big themes? And then doing the, like, sort of more detailed session note, because I mean, everything from a 1 hour session to a 3 hour session, a trillion things happen in the space with the client. And all of it feels really relevant when we are tracking our dynamic with someone so closely. We see these, there was a boundary test here, and there was this beautiful aha moment here, and they were really able to connect this framework to this experience they'd had before. All of that is worth sharing, I think, with a therapist. So get all of that in the sort of abbreviated play-by-play. And then at the end, plans for next session. And then I really like to do additional, like, notes and questions. And that's where I put stuff like, oh, I noticed some resistance in myself. I'm curious if this is something that would best be addressed directly, or something that I should do some work on one-on-one, and then see if I can shift myself, right? I leave space to give the therapist a little bit of a heads up as to the kinds of questions I might be asking when we come to our phone consultation between sessions. So I tend to be pretty robust in the documentation, because there is so much going on, and some therapists love that, and some therapists hate that.
I use Lou's note templates. So I'm like, yes, Lou, thank you. I really appreciate hearing how you use it. And I think I use it kind of similarly, but maybe I'll tweak it a little bit. Brian can attest to this, because Brian has supervised a lot of my work. And in the beginning, I would write stories. Like, I would have this whole narrative, like I wanted to set the scene, and I wanted Brian to know exactly everything that was happening so I could get his feedback. And now what I've done is I've started to make a plan for the session. So I have like an outline going into the session, and then I can transfer that over to the notes, and it really helps me keep things a lot more brief and not quite so wordy, which has helped a lot. But yes, some therapists love it, and some would rather probably me not even send it, almost, because I don't really want to have to read it all. I also have found that as I've have more experience, I maybe don't need Brian supervising as much. But what I find is when I have a brand new therapist to the work, having the therapist have access to Brian's notes on my notes is kind of like another level of like meta. Like, it's like the therapist gets to see my perspective, but then also gets the benefit of Brian's perspective, which sometimes is funny because Brian doesn't know the client. And then the therapist and I get to have a conversation about, yes, Brian has a suggestion, but here's why Brian's suggestion maybe isn't quite the right suggestion, because the client is a little more nuanced than that. And so we get to have a conversation about, are you feeling that too? I'm feeling like this might be too much for the client. And then there's another level of conversation there. So that's kind of how I handle documentation.
Oh, that's cool. That's good to hear. Yeah, I do notes very similarly to how Michelle and Lou do them, because there's a part of me that is a geeky teacher. I always like to include in my notes a little blurb about the theory and practice of new exercises as they show up. Because for many clinicians, surrogate partner therapy is kind of a black box, right? You don't know what goes into it. And I really want to open that black box up. I want to have there be some transparency in the process. So you know what your client is doing. You know why we're doing the exercises that we're doing. You know, when we work on a hand caress, with a client, it's not we're just holding hands for the sake of physical affection. There are reasons why we're doing that. Not that physical affection is is not a legitimate thing in and of itself. But yeah, I include that in my notes. It makes it a little bit lengthier still, but at least clinicians can go back to it and say, oh, this is why you're doing what you're doing. Because then the layer of thought under that is, well, this is the spot that this exercise pokes. This is the tender spot that it pokes because it's doing this thing, because there is this layer that is contributing. And if the surrogate partner and the clinician are both talking on that level, you can get some really, really cool information out.
I guess the only thing I'll add to that is you figure out maybe in the collaboration the way that's going to work best for this team in this case. And yeah, sometimes, you know, I will take very detailed notes for myself. And some of that, you know, doesn't necessarily need to be shared for consulting. I'll make judgments, you know, because sometimes it will be like down to the minutia of the small talk that happened. Like if it, particularly in the beginning, right? When it's super detailed, then I'll try to sort of boil down like what's essential, because we all have limited amount of time to read notes and then discuss them. But then I'm glad that I have them, because then something may come up when we actually talk that I want to like go back to my longer notes and pull them out. On the topic of documentation, obviously the first piece of documentation that happens is the release of information, and we have release of information from the therapist to for the therapist to share with the surrogate generally, because ideally they're working with the therapist first, and then, you know, but we both have some information so that the client, it's very clear with the client that this is what we're doing. It's documented that we are going to be talking about what's going on and potentially, you know, any kind of thing that happens in the sessions. And I think it's totally, I would encourage therapists to, you know, talk and ask questions about, you know, how with a surrogate partner, if you're collaborating for the first time, how you handle the documentation, how you handle release of information. If you have questions about how we hold on to records, like that's not as a technical matter in some ways, all your professional responsibility, but I think they're good things to ask. We're not, you know, necessarily covered under him in the same way, but we take client confidentiality very seriously, and as therapists do have our systems of how we protect that information. But those are all good questions for therapists to ask, certainly. Before we close on, I guess I just wanted to ask, like, what other things do you want therapists to know about working with clients and surrogate partners in the Triadic model?
I'll jump in. I have a couple things. I love recommending to new therapists Betty Martin's book on the gift of receiving and giving, because it is so much the why of a lot of the early exercises of our work. And Betty Martin is so, like, her explanations of the work is something I can't do nearly as well. And so getting a view of, while it's not about surrogate partner therapy, it is very much about the first stage of the work, the exercise that I do with my clients. So I always recommend that. The other thing I recommend, and I've seen a lot of value in with therapists that are new to the work, is when they take Andrew Hartman's class on how to work with a surrogate partner through the Surrogate Partner Collective. I've worked with new therapists that haven't, and I've worked with new therapists that have, and it is a night and day difference, and everyone on the team benefits from their investment there.
And I will second, third, and fourth, both of those recommendations.
Yep, agreed. I think what I would like to add to, as kind of a take-home note is working in a therapeutic triad often brings up feelings for the clinician, that there is a notion of what the therapeutic container looks like. And surrogate partner therapy is very, very different. And it may be challenging. It may bring up things that you didn't know you had issues on, whether it was sexual shame or questions about ethics or whatever. That's okay. It's okay that we are both professionals working in slightly different containers with our own sets of rules and ethics. Talk to your surrogate partner about that. Talk about how it's different for them versus you. If you have concerns, whether it's in the very beginning or whether they crop up in the middle, share it. If you're uncomfortable with explicit conversation about sexual acts, it's okay. You can talk to us about it, because that's all in service to the work.
I would like to add that, man, the longer I do surrogate partner therapy, which at this point is 7 years as a surrogate, that it never ceases to amaze me how expansive it is, right? I have done work with clients that has been mostly about alleviating their anxiety about sex when they're inexperienced, or their anxiety about their capacity for sexual function after significant changes to their bodily ability. But more often than not, these huge, big, expansive revelations for clients come in the forms of communication, come in the forms of, oh my gosh, I've completely locked myself away from figuring out what I even want out of anything, right? I'm so frequently in the serving role that I just do not, I don't know how to be in touch with what I want. And so I would say, like, as a request, if you've got stuff hanging out, even if it seems totally unrelated to relationship, to intimacy, absolutely bring it to the surrogate partner and say, we've got some big themes floating in here, and how can we keep an eye on that together? Where are some places where you think you can maybe help them grow and press into this? Because the amount of someone's internal world that we can touch and engage with as surrogates is just tremendous. And so I think I would say, I would love to find myself in cases, and I have, when it has happened, I love to find myself in cases where we, this relationship is really utilized to the max. And we do get to play in a lot of these spaces of utilizing this relationship and this modality for a lot of different things.
Glad you mentioned that, because everything and anything that comes up in relationship with other people, stuff that can come up for the client in surrogate partner therapy. So we are not just the sort of, we are not just there to be the sort of like, sex education technicians, or even the sort of learning about touch technicians. Absolutely. And also sharing about what are the other big themes that may, implicate connection, how we show up with other people, which is basically anything. Even though, there may be stuff that the therapist is working on with the client that like may not become central to what they're doing with the surrogate. Usually it's all connected, right? If surrogate partner therapy is right for someone, and we're in the triad doing this work, then probably any big theme that's coming up in talk therapy is going to be relevant, is going to show up in some way with the surrogate partner as well. So not thinking overly narrowly about what our realm is in terms of the issues that are coming up. Clearly, we each have a defined role in terms of what we do with the client and how we show up and who we are with the client. But in terms of this, the issues the client is working with, sometimes it pays to sort of just be aware of all of the terrain. So there are so many other topics related to this that we could touch on, right? Like how do we know when somebody needs surrogate partner therapy versus just different approach to talk therapy versus maybe other somatic modalities that are out there. We could, talk about different challenges that have come up around closure, around interruptions in the work. I mean, there are so many directions that we can and probably will another time go into. But do you all have any last thoughts this time for therapists about doing this collaboration together to support clients?
I want to throw one thing in the ring that wasn't mentioned as a resource. We have Lou. Lou can offer some supervision or support to the therapist from another therapist, right? Like it's there. Nobody mentioned that. And I was like, well, if Lou's not going to toot her own horn, I'm going to pop in and toot her horn and say, like, there is direct help. Andrew's class is great to get you started, but what do you do when you hit that bump in the road? Lou has the ability to wear both these hats, and I can only say has a world of information on this and feedback and support. And let's not forget that we have this amazing resource right here in our community.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, I just actually published my outpatient professional website. Woo, small victories. But in there, one of the things that I offer for other clinicians is not only these like touch point, like Q&A sessions that I totally would do for free and really want people to ask for, but also if anyone would like supervision or kind of peer support from me while they supervise a particularly tricky surrogate partner case, I'm absolutely available for that. I think the broader base of really phenomenal engaged supervising clinicians we can have on the East Coast, the more accessible this work will be to the clients who need it. And so I am absolutely down to show up to give that kind of peer support when folks want it. So absolutely do.
Thank you so much, Lou. That is such a fantastic resource. I know that, therapists I've talked to, they have benefited so much from being able to talk to other therapists who have worked with surrogate partners. Everybody approaches their work differently, but it's really, really helpful because they can talk to us as surrogate partners, only along about our experience from our end, but therapists are in, other therapists who are in their world and in their role can be a really helpful role to talk to. And there are, fortunately, some folks like Lou who have experience working on both of those different roles in the kind of, obviously, those of you who are wondering, obviously with different clients. But there are some folks out there who have done work in both of those roles, and our wonderful Lou Hansen is one of them and can be a really great resource to talk to really get an idea from another therapist's perspective of what this work is like, how did you approach it, and maybe help answer some questions from a therapist point of view. So with that being said, therapists who are maybe you're a sex therapist, maybe you are focused on relationships, maybe you focus on working with different populations, LGBTQI people, but really any therapist who works with clients around issues around interpersonal relationships could collaborate with a surrogate partner. And if it's something that you are curious to learn more about, definitely check out the resources that we have mentioned here, things like the Penny Martin and Robin Dalzell book, Art of Receiving and Giving, Andrew Hartman's trainings through Surrogate Partner Collective. Reach out to Lou or another therapist, reach out to any of us. We're happy to talk to you about how we could support your clients and collaborate with you to do beneficial work that builds on and goes beyond what you can accomplish in the therapy room. So thank you so much, all of you, for listening, and thanks Michelle and Ryan and Lou for sharing your experiences today. And we look forward to talking with you all some more soon.